Hi everyone, thanks for coming. Ellie is just getting himself set up, and then we'll launch right into it.
Okay, can everybody hear us? Just wave, put up your hand if you can. Fantastic. Thanks, Kirsten. Thanks, Ron. Thanks, Sarah. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. It's now 12:02. So, first of all, just a couple of housekeeping things. We're recording this webinar. We'll leave questions till the end. So I'm going to be talking for the first 20 minutes or so, followed by Will from PropCode. And then there'll be questions and answers for about 20 minutes because I'm sure everyone's got a lot of questions and hopefully we're going to be able to answer them as best we can. And just lastly, as I said, we are recording this, so we will send you our slides as well as a recording of this webinar in a few days' time. So let's kick it off. Okay, so I'm going to be covering probably the boring stuff, which is really the planning, controls, and a bit of a quick overview of what the LMR is. For those that you don't know about the LMR, hopefully you'll get something out of this webinar. We're going to cover the areas that are excluded by the low mid-rise policy. What does low and mid-rise housing actually look like? Some of you can see there's a few architects here. So some people here already would know what these types of developments physically look like, but we're going to briefly cover off what they look like in reality, as well as the general terms that the planning legislation defines these as. And I'm also going to share with you some case studies on two properties in the Northern Beaches, as well as some useful tools for you guys to use at your leisure. Here is just a quick plug for Navon Planning. So we've been going for 11 years now. I've had almost 20 years experience as a planner, working in probably almost every council in Sydney, as well as some regional councils too. And we do DAs, CDCs, view assessments, and everything else in between. So what is this policy that everyone's been excited about on LinkedIn, in the media, in the news? So what is it? What is it actually? It's actually a piece of policy that it's not a new SEP, it's not a new state policy per se. However, it comes under the banner of the housing SEP under Part 6, under Chapter 6, sorry. And it's an area where it's a policy where this whole state policy, you've got other controls too, like for secondary dwellings, granny flats, apartments, boarding houses, and the LMR policy kind of fits into this SEP. There's a lot of talk also about that it relates to properties that within an 800-meter radius of a train station or a town centre. We'll talk about more where those areas are. There's also, it discusses things called non-discretionary development standards, which are basically clauses where you do need to comply. And if you do comply with those, then, for example, you might comply with FSR under this new policy, and council can't refuse it based on FSR and other matters too. Some people say too, if you are going to not comply with a non-discretionary development standard, then you would have to probably lodge a clause 4.6 variation. But I'm sure if there's lawyers here, they can advise you also that it's not a clear-cut area if you need to put in a clause 4.6 or not. And some people are not fully aware that this policy has nothing to do with CDCs. Will Sullivan from PropCode will be talking about CDCs, how this does benefit in some cases, but by no means, from what I can see in the material or the reading, that the LMR is a quicker process. It's certainly a DA, so you do have to run the gauntlet with council for any LMR project. This is an indicative map. For those that haven't seen these maps yet, The blue areas are shown here are basically town centres that the government has identified. Councils have also been involved with this process for a good few years now. And anything in yellow is presumably within the 800-metre radius. This is a zoomed in version of a map, an aero map, for example. Here you've got King's Cross Station, and anything presumably in this yellow area is included in the LMR policy. But naturally, with town planning and policies, it's not so clear cut. So, how do we measure the distance? So is your property either in or out? Because this policy, it's quite, I would say, different to other planning policies in that it doesn't apply everywhere. It only applies to around 171 town centres and stations. It's not a blanket policy for every property in New South Wales, which in some respects makes it a bit more challenging to work out, are you in or out? And Will can show you what the great work he's been doing with prop code. Makes it much easier for you to work out if you're either in or out of this policy. There is a legal definition of how to measure the distance. So if you read there's a lot of bullet points here. I don't expect you to read them all, but as I said at the beginning, you will receive these slides so you can look at it at your own leisure. But essentially, looking at the third bullet point here, it says here, walking distance means the shortest distance between 2 points measured along a route that may be safely walked by a pedestrian using as far as reasonably practicable, public footpaths and pedestrian crossings. So while it might seem straightforward, it's not. And the last point too is quite important, that if your property is either in or out of this map, this indicative map, it's not guaranteed. Like we'll be able to give you more on his stats that he's found, but I would say probably maybe 95% of the properties in the yellow areas are correct, but there might be 5% or so that you have to measure up yourself. And really, the onus is on you as the applicant of the project to confirm that it's in the policy, it's in this LMR area. So you can see on the screen, this is just an example. I had an inquiry a couple of weeks ago when this first came out. So on the left-hand side is the LMR map, and on the right-hand side is just a Google map that I prepared. So according to this, this person who is inquiring about his property told me that he's got developers looking at his property, but they've told him, "No, you're out. You're out of this. You're not in this map." So he came to me asking, "Well, what do I do?" And there, you can see there in the top right corner there you've got the Edgecliff station. If you move to the right image, which is Google Maps, I just punched in his address and the Edgecliff station, and there is actually a footpath or some type of walking path between his property through that park. I'm not sure what park that is, and up to the train station. And in the definition, it also talks about, well, not the definition, but the way you measure it is to the front entrance of the train station. So this Google Maps takes me to actually the side of the building. So you can see it's actually 700 meters, but I would say it's probably 600 meters or so away from the train station or the entrance to the train station. So in this case, this person's property is clearly within the LMR zone, as long as he can demonstrate that he can physically walk through that park in a safe way. And I'm sure there's plenty of other examples that you'll find with your clients. So there are a whole bunch of properties that are excluded from the LMR. This is probably not the full list, but this is the main areas that are excluded. For example, if it's bushfire prone or in a flood prone area, if it's in the NEF contour or more, if you're basically under the flight path, you're really out of the LMR. And I think Will's put together a map or some statistics on that, and that's quite an important thing. So the maps that are provided by the government don't really differentiate between if your property is in a aircraft flight path or not. So it's really the onus is on you. Um, Naturally, if the property is heritage listed, you can't apply the LMR in that case. You are, though, if the property, though, is in a conservation area, the LMR does apply. It is switched on. And there's other areas too, as you can see in these bullet points, where it's excluded. So what is low and mid-rise housing? For those that don't know, it's basically anything up to 6 stories in height. And really, this discussion has been going on for quite a few years with the state government and planners and architects and everyone in the industry trying to say, okay, we've got a lot of houses in Sydney and we've got a lot of high rise. Anything, I guess, above 6 stories. And the idea here is to try bridge the gap and provide a product that is small in size and proposing, I guess, triggering as minimal impacts as possible to the surrounding area. So you've got here dual occupancies, terraces, manor houses, 3 story buildings, and 4 to 6 story buildings. So you can see here you can have a hybrid of, let's say, shop top housing as well as apartments. But the LMR specifically is only talking about these types of developments, nothing else. It doesn't talk about co-living, boarding house, whole raft of other types of developments. So the LMR only includes these types of developments. So this is obviously a dual occupancy or a semi-detached dwelling. Again, I'm not going to go into the full bullet points, but it's, for those that don't know what a dual occupancy or a semi-detached dwellings, you might want to read on that slide what kind of the definition of what those buildings would look like. Townhouses, I guess the real definition is really multi-dwelling housing, but we know them as townhouses, where they kind of look like this, and they can be strata subdivided townhouses. The next are terraces, so think of like Newtown, Inner West. Those are kind of terrace type of developments that are permitted under the LMR. Again, you can only really strata subdivide them. And this is, I guess, an example of something that was built in Ermington. Manor houses, I don't think manor houses are very popular. I certainly haven't been involved with any manor house developments, but it's basically a 2 story building that contains like possibly 3 or 4 units. So it's a very compact type of building, I would say. Again, I don't know how popular they are around Sydney, but it's something that the government has tried to push or promote for the last few years. I don't know if there's been much of a demand for this type of housing, but again, it's on the radar again with the LMR. And apartments and shop top housing. So for those that don't know, shop top housing is where you've got on the ground level, you've got commercial uses, and on the top are pretty much apartments. And you'll see in some examples too that we're going to show you, you can essentially do shop top housing in an R2 zone in Sydney. So while all your neighbours might be houses, in theory, well, this policy does allow you to have shop top housing. Whether that's viable or not, I don't know. That's something developers and your clients would have to work out, but it permits it basically in a typical suburban street in Sydney. I'm not going to show you all the controls here because there are quite a few, but this kind of just gives you a good summary of the controls. So in relation to dual occupancies and semis, if you look on the left-hand side of your screen, those bullet points kind of point you towards the type of controls, the non-discretionary development standards that would apply in those particular situations. You can also do Torrens title subdivision in certain cases for dual occs, which I think is a good thing. Multi-dwelling housing, but we're talking about in the context of townhouses, like the example I showed you before. Those are the requirements, like a minimum lot size of 600 square meters, a maximum height 9.5, which essentially gives you 2 stories and possibly a third story, like with an attic or something. So the controls are certainly generous, I would say, especially in areas that haven't been developed yet. In relation to the residential flat buildings and shop top housing, there are different controls applying depending where the property is, whether it's within 0 to 400 meters of the town centre or the train station, or 400 to 800 meters. But these are the general controls for 0 to 100 meters. And then in the next slide, you'll see it on the left and the right, there are different controls depending where the property is. So naturally, it only really applies to R3 and R4 zones. And if you're obviously closer to the town centres or the train stations, then you're going to be able to benefit from an FSR of 2.2 to 1 and a height limit of 22 meters. Whereas if your property is 400 to 800 meters away, then the FSR goes down to 1.5 to 1 and the height limit is 17.5 meters. I think that's quite a natural thing in terms of the further away you are from these centres, the less you can develop. And I was giving a presentation a few weeks ago in the Northern Beaches, and someone asked, well, this is all very well and good, but what happens to the properties next door, for example, that are not within the LMR zone? And I explained that, well, for sure that's an issue, but it's something that's taken into account in from an urban design point of view as well as town planning. That there will be properties that are 6 stories, and right next door you might have a single-story house. That's kind of an expected evolution of Sydney. Then just continuing on with the controls, so shop top housing on the left and the right. Again, you've got different controls depending how close the property is to the town centre or the train stations. And here are some other considerations too. So people have asked me, well, hang on, do I just have to comply with FSR and height, and am I all good? Like, well, the answer is no. You've still got to refer to council's DCP in terms of things like setbacks. There's also a tree canopy guide, which is kind of attached to this LMR policy. In the next slide, I'll show you just a screenshot of what that looks like. And then again, in the third point, you can see there, sorry, you do have an ability to actually have more FSR if you're going to be doing affordable housing, again, under the same housing SEP. And then again, yeah, it does apply in conservation areas, which I think would be quite challenging. Here's a screenshot of just the tree canopy guide and the controls for different types of developments, dual occupancies, as well as multi-dwelling housing. Again, while the FSR and height controls are very generous under the LMR, you've still got to, I guess, navigate and design something around these landscaping requirements. And here are some 2 case studies I'll just share with you that I shared a few weeks ago. So I randomly chose this property in Manly, 38 Quinton Road. It's zoned R1. You can see in the bottom left, it looks like a nice old heritage building, but thankfully it's not. It's not heritage listed, so that means yes, the LMR is switched on in this case. I've also done a little Google walking map there. I think it's 700 or 600. Can't really read it, but it is within 800 meters, according to this, of the town centre. And in the right aerial, you'll see that's just an aerial of the actual property. You can see it's in a typical suburban area. And the property is 525 square meters. And remember that number because it's quite important. So I've kind of done a quick review. Like if you wanted to do a dual lock on this property, technically you could. It meets the requirements on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, I looked at what about a block of apartments? And you could technically put apartments there. The site is big enough. It's not heritage listed. In theory, yeah, you could do that on that particular property. But you'll see here, when we're looking at townhouses, you actually need to have minimum 600 square meters. That's a bit funny, I guess, that for a block of apartments, you only need 500 square meters, but for townhouses, it can be 600 square meters. Obviously, for townhouses, you require more space for driveways and parking. So maybe that's why you're given you need more space. But on this particular property, you can't do townhouses. You could do shop top housing, in theory. Like as I said before, like it would look a bit funny having a shop top housing in the middle of that suburban area in Manly, but the controls technically allow it. Moving on to the second and last case study. Again, a property in Northern Beaches. It's in DY. So this time I put two properties together. So you get a property that's 1,125 square meters and a width of 26 meters. And again, it's only R2, mind you, that this property. And I did the walking distance in the middle. You can see it's about 700 meters or so to the edge of that DY town centre. Again, it ticks the box. It is in that area, so definitely. And so what could you do on the property? So I looked at townhouses. For sure, you could do townhouses. And for sure, you could do a block of apartments on that property. And that wraps up those case studies and just some final useful tools for you guys to use at home or at work. Prop code, Will's going to be talking next, and he can tell you more about what his platform does. I've been using it myself, and I can really vouch for it. You've got the LMR indicative maps. You've got Google Maps, and you can see I've put links here, so you can just click on those links, and you'll get through to those different websites. You've also got the planning portal, the spatial viewer, and last but not least, I've prepared a ChatGPT chatbot for you. You can play around with that, and I've basically uploaded all the LMR documents in there, and you can, if you're struggling to get an answer from the Department of Planning or Council, have a crack at this and let me know how you go. So I'll now pass on to Will. Will, do you want to share your screen? But I just wanted to, while Will sets up his screen, I just wanted to um, there you go, Will. You can. There you go. I just wanted
Yep.
to. The reason I asked Will to come on board today was, uh, just like me, he's very active on LinkedIn, and I found that he's already done the number crunching and probably number crunching that the government hasn't even thought of themselves. So I thought I would bring him on today to share the research that he's done already, because I think it's going to be very valuable for our clients. And Will, I will let you take it away.
Yeah, nice. Thanks, Ellie. There was a lot of great info there. And Prop Code, if you haven't heard of us, we're a software company. So we offer urban planning software. So Ellie, for example, is a town planner. He would write the applications if you work with him, for a DA. PropCode is not a planner. We're a software company. You come to our website and use our tools online, and that's a great way to find out some info pretty quickly when you're looking at a project, starting a project maybe before you've found a planner to work with you in greater detail. And so as a result, I've worked as a planner myself before starting PropCode, and so I know how to read these rules and how to put the maps and the rules together to work out the answers for various cases. And so PropCode is software that is hopefully innovating around being able to work out these answers in a more automated way, rather than everyone across the industry having to kind of bash their heads trying to work out, what does this mean? What does that mean? What does that map say? What does this answer? You can come to PropCode to find that out. So as a result, PropCode had a big opportunity in terms of helping people understand this new policy. It is very complex, as you've just heard. Ellie really just scratched the surface, to be honest, and there's a lot of complexity in it, a lot of overlapping and contradicting things, and a lot of it says this, but then that's ruled out somewhere else. And so, in order for our software to get to the right answers, I've spent a lot of time reading the rules and looking at the maps and doing some of our own calculations of prop code. And so, hopefully, I can contribute some extra info here as well. And there will be lots of questions, I hope. Ellie and I would love to be answering questions. So, we're going to get to a lot of questions here, hopefully, in this webinar. And then come, reach out to us after the webinar if you still have more questions. Ellie said that I would speak about CDC. We at PropCode have done a lot of work on CDC, and we have a tool that helps people understand CDC eligibility. It's not something you can always do on a project. On residential projects, you might have a CDC pathway. That's the fast track approval through a certifier rather than a DA lodged at council, and that can be a better option, but you can't always do it. And so some people try to do CDCs if they can because it's just a slimmer, faster, streamlined process. Um, the low mid-rise policy is not targeting CDCs specifically. So I've got some info here on the slide. But everything that Ellie's just said actually really only applies to DAs. So lodged through council, not lodged through a certifier. There are a couple of things that kind of leak out, if you like, from the LMR rules into the CDC side. They're usually quite separate, quite partitioned from each other. However, there are just a couple of little things that do change because of this, the way they wrote the new LMR rules. We didn't talk much about subdivision there when Ellie was talking about the standards, but a couple of things that are benefits in the LMR rules is a smaller subdivision child lot size for dual occupancies and for terraces. And those, the dual occupancy one does apply to CDC as well. This is really getting into the nitty gritty. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, that's all right. Don't worry about it. One thing that's important is, and I'll mention this and it says on the next slide as well, but we talk a lot about permissibility in planning. If town planners or architects or whoever probably know about this concept of permissibility. It just means that there's a zone that the land is in. So R2 low density residential, for example, that zone has a list of things that are permissible and a list of things that are prohibited. And sometimes other rules can change what is permissible or prohibited in a particular zone or on a particular site. The LMR rules have changed some of that permissibility, and that's one of the big benefits. So, for example, you could now build apartment buildings in any residential zone if it's in an LMR area. So that's a new permissibility that overrides any LEP local zone permissibility or prohibition. That permissibility does apply to CDCs as well. To do a CDC, what the first condition is, it has to be permissible and not prohibited in that zone. So anything that changes permissibility would also trickle over into CDC eligibility. The dual occupancy permissibility is actually the very first stage of the LMR reforms. They didn't call it LMR at the time, but last year in July 2024, the government said, you know, the first thing we want to put out there, stage one, is dual occupancies are now permissible in the R2 low density residential zone statewide across New South Wales. So not anything to do with the LMR catchments, the 800 meters, not restricted to that area, but any R2 zone statewide. Now that is not something you can use for CDC yet. They've wrote in an exception that says if something is permissible only because of that change in July 2024, then you can't take that into CDC. However, with the full package of LMR that they gazetted on 28th of February this year, they've added some other permissibility. As I said, residential flat buildings are permissible in R1 and R2 zones, or R2 zones now that they weren't before. Multi-dwelling housing is permissible in R2 zone that it wasn't before. And that enables those things that Ellie was talking about, those different controls and built form outcomes across residential zones. That permissibility does come into CDC. So although none of the other rules apply, the height, the FSR, those things don't apply to CDCs, you can possibly open up some new opportunities to get a terrace project or a manor house project approved by CDC when it wasn't possible to do CDC before. If that didn't make any sense, that's all right. You can chat with us later. Contact us if you're interested in those sorts of projects. The next thing I want to talk about is just a couple of other things. I mentioned permissible here. Permissible doesn't mean, hey, I can do it. Permissible means it might be possible. It's not prohibited, but you still have to follow all the other rules from LEPs and DCPs. So permissible is really the starting point of any question of can I do this project? Terraces that Ellie mentioned before, and he said this is a type of multi-dwelling housing. There are different ways that you could build multi-dwelling housing, that's 3 or more dwellings on one lot. The terraces is specifically buildings that are facing the road, facing a public road, so not facing into a private driveway. So it has to be that form to be called terraces. And terraces is something you can get approved by CDC potentially. The shared driveway, private driveway situation, you couldn't get that approved by CDC. Manor house is also, Ellie mentioned that one. That's a 3 to 4 dwelling, 2-story apartment building. Also just a special case there. Non-discretionary standards, Ellie mentioned this one at the start. It's kind of a funny way that they've called that term. What it means is council can't refuse it if you stayed within the height limit or stayed within the FSR limit. So council couldn't refuse on that grounds. So they couldn't say it's too tall, or they couldn't say it's got too much floor space. They can still refuse on other grounds, on any other grounds that apply to that project. So for instance, there's a question here already in the Q&A around, can councils, sort of resist and push back and find other ways to refuse? The answer is yes. Yes, they can. So it depends. Your project still has to meet all the other rules. Maybe view sharing, view loss is a reason that they could reject it, even if they can't explicitly reject due to height. So that's a bit unfortunate. You're not guaranteed to be able to achieve 6 stories or 4 stories, or 1.5 to 1 FSR, 2.2 to 1 FSR. Those are just the upper limits. So you do still have to check and follow all of the other rules that might apply from the LEP and from the DCP for that project type. Subdivision is another one. Subdivision of the land can be done on a dual occupancy or terraces, where the dwellings are all not above each other, but side by side. So the LMR rules do include some new numerical minimums for subdivision lot size. However, they don't change the permissibility. And there are actually a few cases where LEPs prohibit dual occupancy permissibility subdivision. So I've spoken to people who weren't aware of that on their site. For example, Lane Cove LEP does not allow subdivision of dual occupancies. So the LMR rules don't unfortunately change that. So if it was prohibited before, it's still prohibited on subdivision. Now, anyway, to my bread and butter for prop code, we have done a lot of work, as I said, to calculate the rules and how they affect each individual property. What are the current planning controls on every property? What's the lot size, the lot width, some of those things that come into the rules. And then, what's the logic in the new rules? We've mapped those 800-meter distances and 400-meter distances. Ellie was talking about that. He showed one example in Edgecliff where the government's indicative map doesn't, seem to correctly show a certain area as being within 800 meters. And I just looked at that, and we did calculate that correctly in PropCode's calculation, that particular site. So we've done a lot of work to work out what are the properties that are affected within those 400, 800-meter distances, and then what are the new rules. What's the difference from the old rules? Did it gain permissibility? As I mentioned, for example, the residential flat buildings are multi-dwelling housing. And then did it get a new FSR or height limit that's higher than the old one? Because if it's not higher than the old one, then that's not really a benefit. So we've been able to put together some of these cool maps. You may have seen some of these on LinkedIn that I've been posting. And I'll talk through some of the numbers, what this means. I'll just say on this map, the gray areas are the exclusions. So the LMR, Ellie had a slide for this before. The LMR policy includes a list of exclusions. So although something may be within the 800-meter distance to a center or station, there may be one of the exclusions that actually knocks it out from being eligible for any of the benefit. So those exclusions are the ANEF, bushfire, some of the coastal mapping. There's flood and pipeline maps that have to be considered. If it's in a TOD area, that's also not eligible for the LMR rules, which is fine because the TOD rules are better anyway. And then a few particular LGAs, Blue Mountains and Hawkesbury, and I think maybe Wallandilly are a couple of them, and Bathurst. So we've considered those exclusions other than flood and pipeline because it's too difficult to get those maps. You can see here on screen, I've got some gray areas. A lot of that is the flight path, the ANEF flight path for Sydney Airport through the inner west of Sydney. If you look carefully, there's a couple of other ones that you could see around up in the North Shore around Lane Cove. There's some bushfire prone land that around the edges of those suburbs. Over on the west around Strathfield, you can see the TOD exclusions. So some gray areas near the stations. Those are already TOD, so they're not part of LMR. What does that look like numerically? So there are 228,000 properties across New South Wales that are in any LMR catchment. So the 800-meter distance to a center or station. 85,000 are within an inner 400-meter distance, and then 143,000 in outer distance. 10,000 of those are in TOD, as I said, so they get the TOD rules instead of the LMR rules. 31,000 fall into one of the other exclusions. Again, I haven't considered flood and pipeline, so those would knock out some more in addition to the 31,000. And then heritage conservation area that was asked, and Ellie did mention this. Heritage conservation area is not excluded in any way from the new rules. So all of the LMR rules do apply and potentially can be used by a project that occurs in a heritage conservation area. It may be difficult, as you can imagine, to demonstrate that you're conserving heritage by building a 6-story apartment building next to a row of historic terraces. So that one is going to be a very tough one. For practical reasons, it's probably easier to consider that those aren't going to get the full benefit of LMR. And that's the red block on this little bar chart here at the bottom. Some of these are existing strata plans. So you can imagine those may be a little bit difficult to get all the owners to agree to redevelop the property. So potentially not great opportunity there. And then 31,000 are too small for the lot sizes. So LMR does introduce minimum lot sizes to be able to build any of the building types. That leaves 105,000 of those 220,000 that are opportunities for the LMR benefits. Now, some of them actually, as I mentioned, may already have a higher FSR or height limit than the LMR rules give them. That's actually the case in a lot of Sydney, LGA, for example, City of Sydney, some of the inner suburbs. Some of them are in heritage conservation area, but some actually just have a better FSR limit anyway. So the LMR is not much of a benefit. We worked out on the ones where there is some uplift, a higher FSR thanks to LMR. The potential additional capacity might be as much as 420,000 new dwellings in total. The government has said that 112,000 in 5 years was their goal for this policy, and that is potentially achievable. 420,000 is what I think is the full amount that is created by this policy in terms of theoretical space. So we'll see how much of that gets delivered in reality. There are 40 LGAs that are touched by this policy. So that is a lot of opportunity. Nearly every LGA across Greater Sydney up toward Newcastle and down to as far as Nowra. So there's a lot of opportunities around. If you're unsure which areas are covered, as you might well be, the best thing is to go look at the planning portal spatial viewer, as Ali mentioned before. Have a look at that indicative map and get a quick glance at which stations and centers are covered by this policy. Because it's not everyone. They've been selective in choosing which centers and stations they want to get this benefit. And I'll mention a little bit of plug. If you like what you've seen on those maps or our analysis from PropCode, and you want to get your hands on that data property by property in a big spreadsheet, 220,000 properties or just your LGA, come to our website, go to data extraction, propcode.com/data extraction, and we can provide that data for your purposes. If you're interested in just your one property, this is very simple. We have a free tool. You don't have to pay anything. You don't buy a report. Just come to our home website and there's a drop-down menu at the top. Click on New South Wales Planning Reform, or scroll a bit down the page to the green box and click on the free lookup tool. And you can punch in your address. Your title identifier actually is what you'll use in the form. And we will send you an email immediately from our system with the calculated LMR impacts or whether it is or is not eligible. And when we send these slides around, you'll have that link on this slide to click. I think we are ready for questions. And Ellie, you can also jump back in. I am looking at some questions already here in the Zoom Q&A feature, and please keep typing in more. And we'll just spend the rest of the time answering these questions. Up at the top, James Watt-Smith, you've asked a few here. So we talked about DA and CDC. DA projects are ones that get applied to through council. and council is what we call the consent authority, as you've mentioned. For a CDC project, those can be approved by a private certifier or technically by a council certifier as well, but that's a separate pathway to DA. So as I mentioned, it depends which pathway you're going as to which rules apply, but the LMR rules don't generally change anything for the CDC pathway, at least not numerically for height or FSR. It's still the old CDC rules. There are a couple of questions around achieving the FSR and things like setbacks. And I'll just briefly answer, and then Ellie can take over. The FSR is not something you're guaranteed to achieve. So if it says 2.2 to 1 is the LMR maximum FSR for a site, there's no guarantee that you can actually create a design within all the relevant rules that would add up to 2.2 to 1 FSR. So there are some complaints from the industry that I've heard around that being sort of a redundant limiting factor, if you like. There's a height control and there are setback controls, and some people would say that should be enough. There doesn't need to be a separate FSR control that artificially limits it otherwise. But I might hand back to the planner in the room and he can comment further.
Thanks, Will. Yeah, really appreciated your presentation. Very insightful. As a planner, it's hard to not be a numbers person because you're guided by complying with the numbers, but your data and your research really makes it much easier, not just for me, but I'm sure everyone else here understand the complexity of it as well as which properties could be unlocked and redeveloped in the future. See, there are quite a few questions here, but I would say too, and maybe a lot of the questions you would be answered by councils. So pretty much every single quote that we're sending out now that relates to an LMR project, we're telling clients have a pre-DA meeting with councils because I think it's a bit silly to put something to council, let's say a six-story apartment building in an R2 zone where there's all these other houses there without consulting council. I think for two reasons. Number one, obviously because councils have never assessed or approved anything under the LMR yet. That's number one. And as consultants, as practitioners, we need to be working with councils, I believe, with this. It's not going to be easy for them either. And reason number two is councils are under strict timeframes to determine applications. They need to have an average of 115 days to determine applications. And I would say if you're going to be lodging an application that involves the LMR, it's going to take a lot longer for council. So that's why, yeah, pre-DAs, if there's any planners here, feel free to disagree with me, but I think a pre-DA in this particular situation will be very worthwhile. I'm just reading some questions. Nilesh, thanks for joining. You asked when they mentioned 0 to 400 meters and 0 to 800 meters distance, does this mean walking distance along the walking route, or is it flight distance? Nilesh, I think it's just the walking distance. I put a slide previously with that definition. Someone said, is there a link to the pack with the links, please? Yes, in our slides, there's links there, as well as if you look at the ChatGPT bot that I prepared, everything is plugged into that, all the controls, the tree canopy, everything. It doesn't go to the full extent of is my property in or out. For those questions, you've got to go to Will's prop code, but the ChatGPT will help you navigate the policy. George Lynn, how do I get presentation of the slides? We'll send them out to you the next couple of days. And someone's asking, are properties that are heritage item excluded or heritage conservation areas? I think we've covered that. Ron Choi, I'm not sure if he's still here because naturally people have dropped off because the more interesting part of the seminar is kind of ended. He asked, where did it go? Yeah, if we're in a conservation area within 800 meters to a train station or town centre, however, not listed on the LMR app, LMR map, sorry, dual occupancy is still permitted. Um, well, I think Will was kind of suggesting that before. So from last year, properties, some councils allowed now dual occupancy since the 1st of July last year. Like my local council, Ku-ring-gai Council, allows dual occupancies, but there's no controls that apply that you can really lodge something against. Will, are
And
there
on
any?
that point,
Yeah.
dual occupancies can be built in any R2 zone by DA, thanks to last year's permissibility.
Okay.
Um, it would depend what other rules sit within that LEP or DCP that might need to be followed.
Yeah.
Uh,
And from 1st of July, I believe they're going to allow CDCs.
yeah, they had said
Dual
1st of
occupancy.
July. They have now made that a bit more rubbery and said mid 2025, but that's this year. The
Okay.
DA, the CDC pathway will
Yep.
open up for DAs. Oh, sorry, CDC pathway will open up for dual occupancies.
Yep, for sure. Will, there any questions there that you want to try have a go?
Yeah, I've answered a few directly by typing. There actually are some questions, and Ellie, maybe you could take them. There's a theme around amalgamating and different parts of the land or different lots within the amalgamation having different controls, thanks to being less or greater than 400 meters or
Yeah.
one heritage and one not. You want to
Yeah,
talk about your thoughts on that?
I had this question come up a few weeks ago in my presentation in the Northern Beaches. So someone had a situation where part of the prop that they have two properties, they own two properties. One side of the property is inside the LMR and the other one is not. So I suggested, well, if you consolidate the two properties together, so then it becomes one lot. So then it's all connected. So presumably then it's all within the LMR zone because at the front of the property, let's say that's where you're going to be walking to the station or to the town centre. And the whole property technically is within that LMR zone. So that might be something people want to do. Or if your neighbour is in and you're out, then yeah, think about consolidating. That might be something people want to consider to get within the LMR area.
There's a question here, a few questions about dual occupancies. So I might try to kind of summarize that
Yeah,
again.
perfect.
So dual occupancies are potentially permissible in a variety of zones, as per the council's LEP, how they've chosen to put dual occupancy in the different zones. As I said, we've now said a few times, the R2 zone, the state has said all R2 zones statewide now have dual occupancy permissibility, minus the exclusions that are general to the LMR policy. So places like Ku-ring-gai did not allow dual occupancy before July last year. And so the council LAP still says it's prohibited. But this policy in Housing SEP Chapter 6 now says dual occupancies are permitted, and that overrides the council LEP. However, in cases where the council was happy to allow dual occupancies, they may have put in a minimum lot size to build dual occupancies. So there's quite a lot of those rules around the state. Prop code, I know because we have to incorporate those for our CDC tool. So in the LMR areas inside a catchment, there is now a 450 square meter standard minimum lot size to build a dual occupancy. So that does override whatever the LEP rule might have been. Um, so I hope that's clear. Subdivision usually was an option, and sometimes, so Torrent subdivision usually was an option, usually was permissible, and sometimes there was a minimum lot size in the council LAP that so maybe minimum lot size of 300 square meters, let's say, for the child lots. That is also overridden by the LMR rules in an LMR catchment. So that's 225 square meters now as a subdivision child lot size. However, to further complicate it, some LEPs did not allow subdivision of dual occupancies, and the LMR rules do not change that. So Lane Cove was one example, Wallara is another, the Hills is another, and they prohibit subdivisions of dual occupancies. or in R2 zone at least. And the LMR rules do not change that. They don't make it permissible to subdivide. So it's all very complex, unfortunately.
Yeah, yeah. Well, to your point, Will, it's important that people are aware that it is very complex. But in my mind, this is really geared towards, I would say, mums and dads and small-time developers rather than the big guns coming in. Because again, we're talking about up to 6 stories in height. And one would think that this policy would be easy to navigate for the mums and dads, for example, that have the property and they want to split it or whatever for a dual lock. But it's a minefield of planning legislation. I think it could have been done a lot easier, but this isn't the forum to do that. But I guess it makes our jobs as planners and architects, designers, practitioners to really unlock these policies and apply them on people's properties and so that they can understand what they can actually do and whether their property actually fits in or not. And that's where prop code comes in also.
Yeah,
Um,
and I'll mention I've talked a bit about CDC as something that we help with, that our software helps with. So that's a simple product that you punch in an address and you buy the report from us, and it says this is all online, all on our website. It says here's the things that you're allowed to do with CDC and things you can't do with CDC and the reasons why, as per all the rules that govern CDC. We also separately have a different tool, which is a kind of initial planning analysis for a DA pathway. So checking the LEP and the DCP rules. And that's called a rapid planner report. That doesn't replace Ellie or an expert town planner, but it is a first stop where you can get our expert software. We've started to automate this process now to read through the rules for you and pull out the key answers. And so that our software does consider the LMR rules and how they all interlock and the exclusions, for example. So things like that. So if you'd like a first point of call before signing up, for a deeper bit of work with a town planner, you can come to PropCode's website and get some of those answers.
for sure. There's a few more questions and then we might wrap it up in about 5 minutes or so. Ron, sure you've obviously looked at the policy in detail. You've got some good questions around does it apply if it's in a bushfire area, if it's got a low bowl? Um, I don't know the answer. I'd have to check that. You've asked
Yeah.
about
Can I help
yeah,
distinguish that? So there's bushfire
yeah,
prone land, which is the council standard mapping. You can always see that online. Uh, and as an example, PropCode does have that mapping layer. So the LMR by definition doesn't apply in bushfire prone land. So no matter what the BAL levels are. BAL is a more precise calculation on a site, and that has to be done by a qualified consultant. So it depends. That's more granular thing where you're getting into the building design. And CDC, for example, can't be done in 40 or flame zone for the BAL, but you'd have to get quite a sophisticated analysis done on that site
like
on the
consultant.
BALs.
Yeah, good question, Ron. Robert Jokovsky, good to see you. Hope you're well, mate. You've asked, will LGAs reflect all this in the 10.7 certificates? I haven't seen anywhere to say that they are. It would be lovely if they do, but I don't think so because there's a lot of complexities involved. Like if you get a 10.7 certificate and it says the property is in bushfire, then as Will said, well, then you're out. The 10.7 certificates don't really tell you either if you're in a flight path or not. You probably should. But it's really the onus is on you as the architect, Rob, to confirm if your client's property is in or out.
Ellie, maybe you could talk about things like clause 4.6 variations and or deemed refusals and going through court LEC to get an approval and how you see some of these things
Yeah,
playing out, like distance,
yeah.
walking distance,
I've
for example,
had
through the court.
I've had someone ask me that question too. They said, "Oh, but my house, we need more floor space than what's allowed." I think it was a lady who owns a property. She says, "Oh, it's not going to work. The
Yeah.
are 0.65, we need 0.7 to 1." And I'm like, well, no. I've actually still got to call her back actually to talk about it more. But the rules are there for a reason. And just because you've got a clause 4.6 or an ability to vary these, it doesn't give you the rite of passage that council's going to approve it. I would say the intention of the whole LMR is to comply. If you tick the boxes, just like a CDC in a way, if you tick the height, FSR, then it makes it easier for councils to approve things. So I wouldn't really run the gauntlet with council and putting in a project for LMR and putting in a clause 4.6. I think that kind of defeats the purpose. And
One
I
thing actually to note about the minimum lot sizes in clause 4.6 is the LMR rules say if you're in an R3 or R4 zone and you want to build the 4 to 6 story apartments, even if there's an existing LEP or DCP minimum lot size for apartment buildings, that's actually wiped out and canceled out by the LMR policy. So it says there's no minimum lot size for R3 or R4 zone. But it specifically says you have to fully comply with the height and FSR rules in order for that minimum lot size to get switched off. So in the event that you had one of those properties, there's an LEP minimum lot size for apartment buildings, maybe it's 1,000 square meters, for example, and your property is less than that. You have to stay within the height or FSR controls. If you go to a 4.6 to change those, you then switch back on the LEP minimum lot size and maybe rule out the possibility of doing the project at all. So there's quite a few nuances in there that can be a bit of a trap. And so yeah, make sure you get an expert to help you understand the detail there.
For sure, for sure. Um, Yep, someone's asked if your site ticks all the boxes, what basis does council have to refuse? Well, you'll
Lots
have
of bases.
everything else under the sun,
Yes.
like
Yes.
overshadowing. The LMR doesn't say talk about overshadowing.
Visual
Um,
privacy.
Setback, visual view loss. If you're blocking someone's view of the opera house because you put up a 6 story building under the LMR, they can refuse it on that basis. There's a lot of grounds in which councils could refuse something. I tell people the opposite. Councils are in the business of approving developments rather than refusing. So it's really our job as practitioners, as consultants, to make it as easy as possible for them to approve your development. I wouldn't start trying to um, be cheeky and put something in that doesn't comply with FSR or height because I think you're just destined for failure with council. Someone's
Well, we've
asked.
reached 1 o'clock.
We've reached one
Any last
o'clock.
urgent questions?
There will be, yeah, we will be providing the slides and a recording of this webinar in the next couple of days. So look out for that in your emails. But I think we've hit 1 o'clock. If you haven't had your lunch already, then feel free to go and have your lunch. But this was really, really beneficial, I think, because something I didn't say at the beginning was Department of Planning actually put on a webinar, but just for councils. And I found out that they weren't putting on a webinar for consultants, for practitioners, for mums and dads, for investors. So I found there was even more of a need for us to do this today, just to get the word out and clarify any questions that people have. But yeah, reach out to either Will or myself if you have any further questions. And thank you for joining.
Come check out PropCode's website to get your free lookup of your property.
Thank you.